Hello, welcome. I am officially wrapping up 2023 as of today. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I read in December of 2023. It is the new year, I'm ready to be done with it. December was an interesting month for reading. I feel like I read a lot, but I think that's because I started a lot of books in November, but then didn't actually finish them until December. There's a lot here, but it's been in my brain a really long time since I've read those books. So bear with me while I fumble through telling you my thoughts on books that I can barely remember reading at this point. We are seated today in front of my TBR in hopes that it motivates me to read them this year. That is for next week's video. Today we're going to talk about the books that I read last year. Finish it up, wrap it up, and then we can move on. First, we finished Before We Say Goodbye by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is the fourth installment in the Before the Coffee Gets Cold series by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, and it continues to follow stories of customers and the staff at the cafe in Japan that I'm sure you're aware of at this point allows its patrons to travel back in time. However, in this one we follow 4 new short stories following 4 new customers who have come into the cafe to transport themselves back in time. In this one we actually focus really strongly on one of the rules of the cafe, which is that no matter how much you try to say or do in the past, it doesn't actually affect the future in any way. It doesn't change anything that's going to happen. If you prevent something from happening, it will still happen in another way. I'm so glad I buddy read this one because the second chapter had me sobbing like nothing else. And I knew the second that we opened with a dog that it was gonna hurt. But unfortunately the other 3 stories actually fell a little bit flat. My main qualms is that the chapters were really quite similar. The stories were really similar. None of the characters really stood out as their own individual people. They were all struggling with similar kind of feelings. And like I said, we focus really strongly on you can't change the past no matter what you try and do. Where in the previous editions of the series, the characters have been a bit more diverse just in terms of their stories and what things they're hoping for from the past. But this one, they were all just a bit similar and all fell really flat, and it was just a bit repetitive. I also didn't like anyone in particular. All the characters had these awful flaws that were just people that I wouldn't like. There is at least one more that's currently released in Japanese and I assume is going to be translated, and Kawaguchi is actually writing another one as we speak. So there's at least 2 more to potentially redeem the series, but this is definitely my least favorite out of the 4 that I've read so far. And then I finished listening to The Demon Tides, which is the 4th book in the Black Witch Chronicles series. This is one of the ones that it really feels like a lifetime since I've read it, because I think I listened to most of it in November, and then I actually told you that I was going to finish it in November and I didn't. I finished it in December. And when sitting down to write my thoughts about this, I actually had a realization that I'm probably gonna have to re-listen to it before the next one comes out, because I don't think I can tell you anything that happened at the start of this book. It's gone. I listened to this one on audiobook, as I've done with the rest of the series as well. Again, I can't really tell you too much about the plot of it without spoiling the rest of the series for you, but in this one we do escalate in the war battle aspect. People have come back together. There was a lot more action in the second half of the book, which I'm noticing is a bit of a pattern for Laurie Forrest. I kind of prefer the second half to be a bit stronger than the first half, and I also really like where a lot of our characters have ended up at this point in the series, which I cannot confirm because, again, spoilers. There was a lot more exploration of, once again, like powers, people amassing their powers to the maximum effect. Also, a little bit more lore in the world about maybe where the witch's powers come from. Our main gal, Ellerin, has gone through the ringer at this point in the series. Again, not gonna tell you, but there's so many things that have happened to this poor girl that where she's currently at and where her character has ended with her powers and all that sort of stuff is a good place for her to be, and I'm very excited for her. I am, however, hoping that the last one is, in fact, the last one in the series, because though I've enjoyed my time here, I'm very ready to be within another fantasy world, as opposed to this one. And then I read Fair Play by w.i.t.c.h, which I don't currently have because I've lent it to someone else. This is somewhat of a self-help book. It is written by w.i.t.c.h, who kind of did a lot of research, and by research I mean she asked her friends about how much mental load and how much of the management of a household the women in a relationship tend to take. She has made like a game out of it, which is where you have 100 cards, you go through them, figure out which ones are important, and then you can split them between you and your partner to figure out what's like equal and fair in terms of load. Now, I have a lot of gripes with this book, and it's going to be really hard for me to review the book itself without reviewing like the game that she's developed, because they're one and the same thing. So all in one. I think the content of like the game has some merit. There's some parts of it that I think are quite helpful, and I will talk about them in a second. However, the book was written and the instructions are made for a very, very specific group of people that are cis straight women in heterosexual relationships with children. There was no real consideration or even just like a mention of any kind of diversity, whether it be any queer relationships or how it could be maybe implemented with people that you're not in a romantic relationship with but still live in the same household. She does address like, if you don't have children, XYZ, which by the way is, if you don't have children, out of the 100 cards you can use 60 of them. So literally almost half of the deck is about children and managing and growing and raising children. And I take a personal gripe with the fact that cleaning is one card. I think that is ridiculous because cleaning is such a huge task in and of itself that cleaning as one card does not come off as fair or equal. The parts I have kept as takeaways have been mostly having a tangible way to look at and sort what is fair in terms of load in managing a household. Also allocating a dedicated time once a fortnight to sit down and discuss the tasks and the things that you have to do. And within that, having a minimum standard of care and outlining what the conception, planning and execution of a task is and what that entails. Again, there's some things that I don't agree with completely in and of that, but I'm taking it with a grain of salt and I'm taking from it what works for me. I actually don't know if I would recommend this to anyone. I think it's helpful in some ways, but not following it like to the T. But it could be helpful to provide, I guess, some context and some tips to managing a lot of that stuff fairly, if that's something that you and your partner or the person you live with or your housemate or whatever it is are struggling with. With that out of the way, next I read The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness, which is the first book in the Chaos Walking series. I'm actually just going to talk about all three of the books in the Chaos Walking series, which are also The Ask and the Answer and Monsters of Men, because I listened to all three of them in December. The first one, The Knife of Never Letting Go, introduces us to this world where we are following Todd Hewitt. He's a 12-year-old, nearly 13-year-old boy in a village of men. There is no women, and all of the men can hear each other's thoughts. However, Todd's world is kind of turned upside down when he's exploring in the swamp one day and he comes across a girl. He's never seen a girl before, and the girl doesn't have noise, which is the being able to hear the thoughts. He can't hear her thoughts. I really enjoyed this one in particular. Patrick Ness's writing continues to be so unique. How he delivers information at specific times when you need to know them, and how that further accelerates and drives the world building for a lot of his stories. And that was the most standout thing I think that I took from his writing in this book. I also really liked reading from Todd's perspective because his naive 12-year-old brain, who was so sheltered, was so inquisitive. And again, I think it's a way to progress the story and introduce us to the things that are happening in the world because Todd doesn't know what's happening in the world. It was quite refreshing to experience a lot of that from his perspective. And Patrick Ness absolutely shattered my heart to the point where I felt a little bit ill at the end of the book. And if you know, you know, I was not okay with that whatsoever. Patrick, how could you do this to me? Overall, I actually think this one was my favorite in the series. Kind of went downhill from there. So the second one, The Ask and the Answer, continues the story immediately where we left off at the end of The Knife of Never Letting Go. But in this one, we start to explore a little bit more around the politics and the war in the world. And we really explore a lot more of like the complexities of human nature and war and colonization, which, while still good and readable and understandable, is so far out of my realm of things that I like to read about, unfortunately. I won't tell you anymore. You can get there yourself if you would like to. We do explore in this one a little bit further around like the noise, but that happens more so and mostly in Monsters of Men, which is the third one in the series. And I liked the second half of the book where we did actually get to explore a little bit more about what noise is and where it comes from and why it exists on this planet. But in the first half of this book, literally from page 1, we dive straight into war and it doesn't stop until the end. So far out of my desire to read. I will say it, I probably would have DNF'd this if I wasn't already halfway through it and it wasn't the last book in the series, because the curiosity of how they were going to get out of what situation that everyone was in was the reason I kept reading and listening to it. But like I said, the war, the politics, the tactics, all those things, well outside of my interest realm. I listened to this while playing Dave the Diver for many, many hours. I'm equal parts glad I did that and also unhappy that I did that, because I think that if I did dedicate most of my attention to listening to it, I probably would have understood more of it. However, it would have taken me so much longer to get through and I was going to be much less likely to actually finish it if that was the case. Redeeming it is that the end was really cool, and I like how Patrick Ness left us at the end really quite questioning what was going to happen and leaving the end really open, but not in a way that could continue into another book. It just sort of left it open to how you wanted to make it. Next, I read the first and second w.i.t.c.h graphic novels, which again I had intended to read in the Bloom and Readathon but did not. I have spoken about these before way too many times, so I'm not going to subject you to that again, particularly because I don't think that many of you are actually going to be interested in reading these. This series is kind of a staple core memory pillar in my childhood, so I'm going to keep reading these, and there are goals around this series for next year. This year, it's this year. But I will say that the story does get better the further into the series that you go. The first one is really quite dull, and I'm surprised they managed to fit 26 novel books worth of content into like 7 or 8 of these. But I'm not mad at it because it means that it's condensed and it's less content for me to consume. All right, the next 3 books I have done a reading vlog for, but I didn't actually tell you about many of my thoughts in that video. So first, I read Jonathan Livingston's Seagull. This is a collection of short stories that follows Jonathan Livingston Seagull, who is a seagull, and the only seagull in his flock that wants to practice and be good at flying. Everyone else in the flock tells him that he just needs to stay on the ground and try to find food to survive. However, that plot is actually kind of just a mode to deliver the theme of what Richard Bach was trying to convey, which in my interpretation is unpacking what it means to conform and be what other people want you to be versus staying true to yourself and doing what you want to do in life, regardless of what other people are saying and wanting you to do. And then prioritizing being truly yourself as a way to then motivate and inspire others to also do that as well and break the status quo or the mold as it is. I kept thinking about this long after I read it, and I still can't tell if it's good or bad, but I thought about it so much that the night after I finished reading it, I had a dream that was basically just this story rebranded as a different narrative. The online reviews for this one are really quite mixed, and I think it depends entirely on when you've read the book. I think a lot of people have read this in their childhood when it probably might have been a bit more relevant to explore being true to yourself and figuring out who you are, versus the adults that have read it and they're like, this is pointless, this is ridiculous, why is this a book? And honestly, I kind of love the duality of that because it really highlights that thing that I say a lot where different people have different experiences in life and they've gone through different things and experienced different things at different times that mean that we are going to interpret ink on paper in completely different ways. And I think that's really beautiful. So despite the fact that this has such polarizing reviews of either you're going to like it or you're going to hate it, I think it's still a very interesting book for that reason. I think the narrative and the story itself isn't actually that important. This is a book that you could read if you want to, and I actually am having a really hard time knowing if I should recommend this to anyone because you're all going to interpret it completely differently, I think, to how I did. So take that with a grain of salt if my recommendation means anything for that. I thought it was okay, and I more enjoyed the experience of continuing to think about it after the fact of reading it and then discussing my opinions with other people who have read it. And then, in that same video, Heartstopper Volume 5 by Alice Oseman, which is the 5th installment of the Heartstopper series. This is a queer young adult love story that follows so much more than just that. In this one in particular, we are following Nick and Charlie as they're trying to figure out what's going to happen with their relationship when Nick eventually goes off to college and Charlie is left at school because they're in different years. But it also follows a really strong narrative of trying to work through codependence, which I'm so glad was mentioned because it's something that I've had a little bit of a gripe with since the start of the series. Though I've got no real relatability with Nick and Charlie, aside from having been that age at some point, I still am so engrossed with their journey and their story, and I still think that the way that these characters are portrayed, they work through such common and transferable difficulties that it's a valuable series, I think, for particularly anyone this age, but also as adults to kind of reflect back on and see what our experiences were like and how maybe that relates a little bit to this. And I also found myself thinking a lot from the parents' perspective in this one as well, which makes me feel like an old person, but that's where we're at in life, I guess. I think the others in the series did hit a little bit harder, but this one was still good. And Volume 6 is going to be the last one. I did confirm the webtoon is going to continue to be updated, and then once that is finished, that will then be bound and then put into Volume 6, and that will be the last one. So it's all cleared, we're all good. The last book I finished in that video was To Be Taughty Fortunate by Becky Chambers, which I also spoke quite deeply about in my top books of 2023 because it made it into my top books of 2023. This is another sci-fi by Becky Chambers, but it is a short story instead of a series of books like her other sci-fi series that she has. We follow 4 people as they are basically on this astronaut adventure to explore space and different worlds and catalogue their findings and researches to send back to Earth. We span decades with these people. We explore their relationships with each other, how they manage the difficult situations, the common things that they would face when in space and doing these things, and when you've been tasked with a mission that will take most of your life. It's short, it doesn't take up a whole lot of time, but it packs in so much content that the story actually feels longer than it is. And I think that really goes to show the strength of Becky Chambers' prose and her writing. She did a fantastic job at condensing the right amount of information. I really didn't feel like we needed there to be more than the 130 pages. And once again, successfully made me cry in a book that is under 200 pages long for the second year in a row. And finally, we ended 2023 technically on Monsters of Men, but the last book I'm going to talk about for 2023 is my reread of Crescent City House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. I'm re-listening to the series in preparation for the third one that's being released on the 30th of January. I'm sure you're all aware of Sarah J. Maas. I don't need to talk about her anymore because she is spoken about ad nauseum, but despite having listened to this twice, the first 100 pages still make minimal sense. But having now listened to this after reading the second one, which is the first time I've done that, so many more things make sense now. And I've been able to go into this reread with a bit of a different lens on the series. So that's been cool. I read that. With one final book show, we conclude 2023 in its entirety. We can move on to next year. This year, it's this year. But thank you so much for coming along today to go through my December reads. Thanks for sticking around at this point if you have. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you're having a fantastic day or night or whatever time it is where you are in the world. And I will see you next week with some 2024 content, finally. Goodbye.